Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, joined today by Jordan McNamara. We are going to talk Dynasty strategy. You can find Jordan on Twitter at McNamara Dynasty. Tell them where they can find the rest of your work and what you've been working on, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. We were talking beforehand. I'm a staff writer at Football Guys, you're an alum of there as well. I also host a Dynasty think tank podcast with Chad Parsons, and you can find me on X, or formerly Twitter, at McNamara Dynasty.
Yeah, I think Aether started calling it like Xeets or something like that instead of tweets, because he's still trying to combine the two. It's a really terrible thing. On today's show, like I said, we are going to talk Dynasty strategy. We're going to talk about startup strategy, rookie draft strategy, trading, and more. We're also going to talk about some of Jordan's favorite values. But like my favorite thing when I'm having a guest on and I haven't like set a rundown for the show is I just go to the guest's Twitter and I'm like, can they provide some content for me? And like I had to hold back. I had like 6 tweets that I wanted to talk about today, Jordan. But we're going to start with one because it's a hot topic and I think an interesting topic. We've talked about these young wide receivers in Garrett Wilson and Drake London that virtually everyone is expecting to have a massive breakout for the second year in a row. Like even though they didn't do it last year because of a quarterback change. And you tweeted out yesterday, Chris Olave has been better than Garrett Wilson since entering the league. You've got the breakdown here: better in targets per route run, better in yards per route run, better in yards per target. Yet everyone thinks Wilson has the elite ceiling and Olave is limited.
Yeah. So this one's confused me, right? I think Garrett Wilson has gotten a pass because of bad quarterback play for 2 years, which I understand that argument. What I don't understand is why that gives him a higher ceiling than Chris Olave, right? It's not really an anti Garrett Wilson take as much as it's just confusing because you look at Chris Olave, and I think one of the things that I've found, especially in Dynasty, is that ADP is explained by about 50% of what the player did in just total points per game last year.
Right.
And which makes sense, right? When you look at the scoring and you kind of go from there, but that hides a lot of information, and it hides like a lot of information on the fact that Garrett Wilson's been inflated by high play volume, right? He's been inflated, and Chris Olave has been dragged down by low play volume. Right. In the last, and just in terms of pass attempts, right. Chris Olave has missed 3 games. Right. So you start looking at these things, and by basically every metric, right, on every, per route metric, Olave is substantially better, like 30+% better. And you just kind of wonder, like, okay, what are you expecting of Garrett Wilson to get that much better? Right. Everything has to get better. And I think people think a lot of Aaron Rodgers is going to improve. One of the things with Aaron Rodgers that I have a lot of concern about, I mean, A, he's 40, B, he's coming off an Achilles injury. He's not played with this team before. He was out all of last season. But beyond all of that, right, 2022 was his second worst yards per attempt as a passer in his career at 6.8 yards per attempt. And he plays at a significantly slower pace than the Jets have played, right? I mean, in terms of in 2022, just that year specifically, they ranked 31st in seconds per play, about ahead of only San Francisco. The Jets were a top 3 team, right, in terms of pacing. And you might think, well, what does that matter? Like, it's a lot more shots on goal, right? It's a lot more plays, right? You have to be extremely efficient if you're going to reduce all that volume. And I just don't know. It just seems a lot less likely, I think, than putting him at wide receiver 8 and underdog and wide receiver 8 and Dynasty ADP. That just seems like a lot. And it feels like all the ranges of outcomes for Olave are better, right? So that's just and combined with his production, they had similar pedigree, they're the same age, right? We're discounting what Garrett Wilson has done and at the same time discounting what Olave has done.
Yeah, I have Wilson at wide receiver 10 in Dynasty. I have Olave at wide receiver 12. So I am like putting Wilson ahead of Olave, and I am expecting Aaron Rodgers, even if he's bad Aaron Rodgers, to be a pretty decent size upgrade over like Zach Wilson and everybody except for maybe Joe Flacco that Garrett Wilson has played with. Maybe he's in that Joe Flacco range. But that seems like the floor for Rodgers this year. Maybe he could be worse. I think the difference obviously is that Derek Carr is still the quarterback of the New Orleans Saints. And so for this year in particular, people have a hard time expecting Carr at this stage of his career to be better than he has been. And so why is Olave going to be better? Is what I think people who discount Olave's upside would say. When you look at those numbers that were in the tweet, like obviously in my opinion, the targets per route run probably don't have very much to do with the quarterback. The other two can be pretty heavily influenced by quarterback play. And so and maybe the targets do as well, because there was a period of time where Wilson was playing with a dump off artist, but Olave's played with the dump off artist basically his entire career because Alvin Kamara is there. Right. So I do think that like having those guys 2 spots apart is pretty much a coin flip territory for me anyway. But there's more certainty because I see like there's people that have Garrett Wilson as top 6 in Dynasty. Probably not warranted if you don't have Chris Olave right behind him. Now, that was not one of our 3 questions for the guests. We do start with 3 questions for our guest every time. The first question is the same for almost everyone. You're starting a new Dynasty league. What is the one rule or setting that is non-negotiable? And we don't allow people to say super flex anymore because too many people said that.
Yeah, that's fair. Tight end premium.
Okay.
I want to be playing deeper in the tight end pool. It's a lot more interesting position than it was even a year ago, right? I mean, you've got an influx of young guys. You've got a middle class now. You've got an older group. There's a lot more strategy involved with it. I really like the 2 PPR setting, so that gets you even more involved in like playing the flex. I think that brings in a lot of different strategy as well. So yeah, definitely juicing up the premiums to make tight end just more valuable compared to other positions, especially when you put it in lineup type decision making.
I like that. I have a follow-up question on that because at CBS, our standard setting has always been 6 points per pass touchdown.
Yep.
That is unusual in the fantasy community. There's more standard settings with the 4. And I think that probably most dynasty leagues are 4. Do you prefer 4 or 6 points per pass touchdown?
I prefer 6. Most of the ones I play in are 6, and I like 6, and I like 6 and penalizing interceptions more.
Okay.
Right. I mean, as it's an imperfect way to penalize poor play, but it's it enhances the value of elite quarterbacks, which I find to be more fun.
Yeah, and I think you say it's imperfect, and Patrick Mahomes last year and Dak Prescott the year before that show you why it's imperfect, because a lot of times interceptions are not the quarterback's fault. I like that idea of increasing the interception. I also am really trying to push towards like let's get a -1 for quarterback sacks.
I like that.
We are definitely seeing analytically that quarterbacks have a lot more responsibility for sacks than we've historically given them. And that is something where we don't see the best quarterbacks in the NFL take that many sacks, at least not most of them. Like I said, we're going to talk almost entirely about strategy on this show, but I want to give you a chance to talk about a couple of guys. So the second question, who do you think the most undervalued rookie by rookie ADP is?
And by the way, on your interceptions and sack point, a lot of times a sack is worse than an interception. Right. Because you look at like the arm punts that Josh Allen makes, right? And everyone's like, oh, he's among the league leaders and interceptions. Well, he threw like 6 of them that were basically punts on 3rd down and long last year. Like, it's where his sack avoidance is much more important than that is a drag. So yeah, I agree with that. I think sacks is interesting. For rookie drafts, I think this year's a really fascinating year. I didn't come into this year thinking that I would be a big Bo Nix guy or a Michael Penix guy, or frankly, a Xavier Legette guy, but they all get like that, Nix and Penix, they're basically top. Yeah, I look at like top 10, top 12 quarterbacks as being a significantly different tier than anything after that in terms of quarterback draft pedigree, just in the NFL draft. And when you have 6 of them going to the top 12, I think, you don't worry so much about the person going 12 as opposed to 10. That's a pretty big group, and that's a pretty solid draft pedigree there with a lot of opportunity. We historically see those guys outperform the rest of the quarterback draft classes. So both of those guys you can get outside the first round in rookie drafts, the super flex rookie drafts. I mean, those are smash outcomes. And Xavier Legette, 20th overall, according to Fantasy Calc, at my last look of it. Like, that's a really, you can get first round quarterbacks or first round wide receivers in the second round of rookie drafts. That is almost always just take the guy, even if you don't necessarily love the guy, right? His odds outproduce those costs. So, so those three guys specifically have come away with a lot this year.
I like that a lot. The range of potential landing spots for Bo Nix and rookie drafts has been fascinating. I have a slow draft going on right now, and he went 10th overall.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen him in, like you said, in round 2. Mm-hmm. I think 10 is probably about right. I'm not a huge fan or believer that Sean Payton's going to be successful in Denver, but I 100% believe that if Bo Nix was going to have success in the NFL, it was going to be in a system like Sean Payton's. I think it's been absolutely perfect marriage.
And you don't even, one of the things that I think people in Dynasty attach themselves too much is to prove that they're right. Yeah. You don't even need to prove you're right. Like, you don't even need to say that Bo Nix is really good and I'm going to take him at, 112 and prove I'm right. Like, you look at guys in the past, like you could sell Mac Jones, who, it belongs in the same sort of family of the quarterback position that I would say Bo Nix does, right? Like, after year 1, you could sell him at a pretty good increase. You could sell him for an elite quarterback in a package. He could be a part of a package, and you don't need to necessarily prove that you're right on the guy or on the evaluation. You just, it's an insulated player for a year, basically, with a decent chance they go up in price, and you can put him into a much better package, right? I think that, and there's a chance you can do that in season, right? Like, what if someone gets off to a poor start, right? What if someone has Patrick Mahomes and he gets off to a bad start and the team's hurt and the person wants to reset, right? Now you've got assets, you got the type of structure there that you can put together with Knicks and some younger players and some picks. And that's something that could allow someone to rebuild, right? So again, you just use Mahomes because I'm always in that business trying to get him. But like, that's the type of opportunity that those guys have.
And then we've got to talk about the old guys occasionally as well. Yeah. Who is not necessarily old, but non-rookies? Who's the most undervalued veteran in Dynasty trade market right now?
I'll just give you the same answer that I've given for about, I think, probably going on about 5 years of this answer. It's Mike Evans. You look, he's wide receiver, at 36? I mean, all he's ever done is be a top 20 guy. I mean, that's all he's ever done. He's 31 years old. He's not that old. I was just checking out his props for this offseason. It actually is better than his redraft ADP. He's like a top 11 guy in terms of his yardage props, up over 1,100 yards. I just, at that cost, he's dirt cheap. I mean, you look at that group of guys, like the guys that are 28 and older that are still wide receiver 1 types on their team. It's Amari Cooper, it's Mike Evans, right? It was Keenan Allen last year, but like that group of guys, Devontae Adams, right? All of those guys are just undervalued because people want from that, I want a big uptick in draft and trade valuation over the next year. That's what I'm shooting for in the 30s of wide receiver ADP. Like, that's a really bad bet historically. You're much better off to just take the guys that are productive in that range, and it allows you a lot of roster construction flexibility.
Yeah, those are the types of guys that give me the most trouble when it comes to putting together dynasty rankings, because like there really should be a slider on all dynasty rankings. Like, are you competing or are you not? Because probably a fourth of the league should have no interest in having maybe a third should have no interest in having Mike Evans on their roster. But there's also a third of the, like, I agree with you. I've got him ranked, I believe, 12th for redraft this year. I think he's a top 12 wide receiver as long as nothing goes wrong. And so that guy is worth a ton to those of us who are competing this year. And it is difficult to put together. Maybe one day I'll just have two sets of rankings, but that sounds like a lot more work. Let's take our first break, and then we'll talk a little dynasty strategy with Jordan McNamara.
Ladies, we shaking.
We are back, and we are talking strategy. I love these kind of shows because besides what we just talked about, these are kind of evergreen shows. This will live for a while, and you can come back to it when you get to the stage of maybe going through a rebuild, which we'll talk about later in the show, or trying to turn from a rebuilder into a contender. But I want to start at the beginning with the startup draft. We've talked a lot on this show about like whether you want to go into year one of a startup thinking I don't want to compete, or you want to try to draft a contender immediately, or the idea of trading back throughout a startup draft. What are your general philosophies when it comes to a dynasty startup draft?
Yeah, it's changed over time. If I'm doing super flex, right, I want to get elite quarterbacks, right? I want to get elite quarterbacks, and I'm willing to trade up for two of them, right? I mean, I call I call Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes the apex predators. Like if I can start a team, and it's possible to do this, right? I've seen it done. I've done it in existing leagues to go both of them, right? I did it in an auction last year, right? To just pay the price because the floor is so high, the ceiling is so high. It's basically a riskless strategy. You talk about undervalued guys, like those two guys are actually undervalued, and they're the top two guys in the format, right? Because there's just not, right? They're just so much far beyond the next tier of guys. So I think like going up and being aggressive to get elite quarterbacks matters. I'll say I like trading down where other people want to pay for certainty, right? For what they believe, right? They want to really express their opinion and they're really certain about something. Outside the top 3 or 4 rounds, I let them pay me to do it, and I'll just trade down, right? I'll trade down. I like to kick future picks into the future, not because I necessarily want to build out, some young team. That's not what my aim usually is. What I usually aim for is like a productive team right now. And if I can kick some picks into the future, I'm not doing it to build a young team. I'm building it to give myself flexibility in season, flexibility to trade for productive players, to upgrade at positions if injuries happen, right? To constantly be moving up. I think having, sliding down in startup drafts while also, drafting productively, I think allows you a lot of different outs on your team. So that's something I really do. And I think just attacking premium positions early, right? Attacking them a lot, right? We talk about my favorite format is playing 2 PPR for tight end, right? In the first 5 or 6 rounds of those drafts, I typically draft, if it's the first 6 rounds, I typically draft at least 5 quarterbacks and tight ends in those formats, right? Just attack the premiums. And those things will help you over the long period of time.
So I want to go back to the start of that answer and the grouping of Allen and Mahomes. And we're kind of unique here from a redraft perspective because Dave, Jamie, and I all have Patrick Mahomes ranked as QB1. And Allen's not QB1 for anybody at the site, but you look at ADP and he's mostly QB1. Maybe he's just right behind QB2 on some sites. And so I do kind of want to ask about if you have any concerns about Allen in this first full year with Dorsey without Stephon Diggs, and maybe Keon Coleman's his number 1 wide receiver. I'm not sure who his number 1 wide receiver is. And then the second thing is in 1 quarterback leagues, I don't think this really matters, but in super flex leagues, which most new dynasty leagues now are that, floor for quarterbacks matters quite a bit more. And I have some real questions about the long-term outlook for Allen, for Hurts, for Lamar Jackson. We've not seen quarterbacks who run the ball as much as they do stay healthy and stay productive into their 30s. It's much easier for me to look at Mahomes and say, we've got a decade of him with QB1. That's why he's my dynasty QB1. So I want you to kind of like first talk a little bit about, do you have any concerns about Allen still being 1 or 2 this year? And then have you had any thoughts about like how these rushing quarterbacks are going to age?
So good question. From the period of time, I think Diggs's last 100-yard game as a Bill was in like week 9. And from that point on, right, without any Stephon Diggs 100-yard receiving games, Josh Allen was quarterback 1.
Yeah.
Okay. And that, by the way, was when Dak Prescott was going thermonuclear. I mean, he was going crazy, right? Throwing touchdown passes, just a huge season. Allen was quarterback 1. Okay. So I don't have a ton of concern about that. Again, he's a double-digit rushing touchdown threat every year. I'm not super concerned about Diggs because Diggs wasn't an important factor in Josh Allen's fantasy production, and we saw him as quarterback 1 during that stint. So I'm not super concerned about it. I get the concern about the quarterback running, but if you look at it, like so many of the injuries happen in the pocket, right? Like
Right.
I think that we don't have a huge sample, and I think this is one of the hard parts about analytics. We don't have a huge sample of guys where we can say like, hey, this rushing threat caused XYZ injuries, right?
Right.
Because we haven't, it's only really been like 10 years where we've seen the quarterbacks run like this.
Yeah, and I want to clarify. I'm not necessarily saying, although Allen has had a couple shoulder injuries the last 2 years, and
Yes.
this was about the point. Like, if you were going to say from a size, the type of hits he takes comparison, well, the only real comparison we have is Cam.
Sure.
And 28 was about the time when everything caught up to him.
Sure.
Now I'm not predicting that for Allen, and I'm not even predicting he's going to get more hurt. It's just that, and it's less for him than it is for Jackson and Hurts, but a lot of their fantasy points come more from running back type production than quarterback type production. Yeah. It's rushing yards. And for Allen last year, it was like you referenced that time. I think he had as many rushing touchdowns in those final 9 weeks as he had in any season before last year.
Yeah.
So it's not so much that I think that they're necessarily more likely to get hurt, as I'm just not sure the way they're producing fantasy points will be as reliable in their 30s.
I do wonder as well, like you mentioned Hurts, right? Is part of the reason that they brought in Saquon Barkley to stop doing some of that short yardage stuff. I don't know the answer to that. I could actually kind of go the other direction and say maybe the reason why they brought in Saquon Barkley is because Jalen Hurts saw the short yardage stuff. We could kind of go back and forth on that. It would be interesting to see. I do worry about like the way Hurts runs a little bit more than the way that Josh Allen runs.
Okay.
Maybe one thing I would say, like I don't know, those like car crash pile up tush push things don't like that doing that a dozen times a game doesn't seem like something that I want to pay do my $200 million investment. Like that's not what I would do. So again, they run a little bit differently. So again, I think it's a concern, but the ceiling's so high. Right. And that's the thing as well. Like the ceiling's so high on these guys that, if Allen does this for, if you drafted Allen 2 years ago, right, and he retired tomorrow and never played again, right, it still probably pays the cost for what you paid, right? I mean, that's how good he's been and how dominant he's been, and the ceiling and floor combination. So I don't, outside of like, I think thinking anything beyond maybe 3 or 4 years, even on those top guys, is too far out to really have a lot of confidence in.
No, that makes perfect sense. And that's what I've been trying to kind of wrap my brain around that. And I think it gets really interesting when you're thinking about a quarterback like CJ Stroud versus Allen or Jackson or Hurts. But Stroud's going to have to show a lot more upside before we have that conversation. Let's talk about rookie drafts. So I don't think that the trade back philosophy necessarily works as well early in the draft, but certainly in round 2, that's something I like to do for the same reason that you said. Like, let somebody else express a lot of certainty about whether wide receiver 6 is 6, 7, or 8. I'll just take the other one and pick up some future picks. Do you have any other, like, just kind of go-to rules when it comes to dynasty rookie drafts?
By the way, do you have any concern? Can I just ask you on the Josh Allen thing? So Ken Dorsey was 5% over passing expectation last year, and Joe Brady was 4% under. Do you have any concerns about that? Because that's the thing about that offense that concerns me more than anything about Josh Allen's concern. It's that they went from being pass happy to run heavy, and I thought that they were worse because of it.
Yes, I do. I combine that with what I expect to be some pretty significant rushing touchdown regression this year off of last year. Because he scored 6 more than he ever had before and didn't run the ball more, didn't have more rushing yards. He just had the touchdowns. And the fact that I don't know if he has any good wide receivers. Like not even, I'm not saying I'm not sure he has a number 1 wide receiver. I'm not sure if he has any good NFL wide receivers. So yeah, those 3 factors, he's my QB4 in redraft this year. I've actually got it Mahomes, Hurts, Jackson, Allen. And he could make me look stupid. He's made a lot of people look stupid over the last 5 years for various reasons. But yeah, I think this could be a monster season for James Cook.
Oh, I love it.
Both because of that increased rush rate and because Josh Allen's probably going to have to throw to him because nobody else is open.
Right.
So I'm pretty high on Cook. He's a top 10 dynasty running back for me, and he's like a top 6 guy in redraft this year. But yeah, that's where I'm at on that. And I lost my track. Well, let's go back to the rookie.
You asked about rookie drafts. Sorry, I totally.
No, that was good.
I'll answer your question. I wasn't filibustering.
No, that was good. Good. So yeah, what specifically, like, how are you attacking rookie drafts most of the time?
So one of the things I like to look at rookie drafts is like look at profiles. So the way I kind of think about that is each position, right? Draft pedigree matters in different ways, right? So the earlier you're drafted in the NFL draft is usually the better, right? That's, I think, fairly obvious. But each position works a little bit different how that declines, right? You look at the quarterbacks, for example, I'd mentioned that like top 10 to top 12 kind of range, right? Where you get 6 of them in that top 12. I kind of treat that as one tier. You can make some specific preferences in that tier, but I do think like identifying that as a tier to be in on and to target, especially at the bottom of it, is really important. So again, I mentioned guys like Penix, I mentioned guys like Nix, kind of identifying that tier and being in on that. The other one is receiver, right? Like when you look at this receiving class, like it's really interesting because you're getting guys like McConkey, you're getting some second round wide receivers going up ahead of first round wide receivers. And anytime that happens, right, you just look, the average wide receiver, first round wide receiver hit rate's about 55%. It's about 35% for second rounders. So just looking at that, your default rule should be first round over second round, right? Your default rule, when you pass on someone with higher pedigree, you have to have a darn good reason to do it.
Right.
And I don't see guys like Adonai Mitchell as being a good reason to go over Xavier Legette as a first round guy. Right? I don't see, you look at some of those, Ladd McConkey's a similar example, right? I mean, the difference between some of these guys, like Xavier Worthy's going almost a full round ahead of another first round wide receiver. Right? When the dynasty community has done that, one of the things that I've learned is the difference in 80, if you just look at players in a tier, so just look at like first round wide receivers, dynasty ADP has not been predictive of future success within those tiers. So what that means is all the work, all the analysis, all the preparation that we do doesn't predict success better than just random chance does. And so if you're taking someone at 10 that's got the same profile as someone at 20, you should probably not take the guy at 10, right? That's a lot of what my strategy has been in recent years, is to just kind of look at those things, arbitrage them, and take advantage of them. So that's how I trade down. But I will trade up in the top of the draft to kind of stop runs, right? If I want to get in on, like, let's say, for example, that you get 3 wide receivers, you get a couple of quarterbacks off, and Drake May's sitting there at like 7 or 8. I'd be apt to like trade up for him, right? But I'm not necessarily going to be like trading up for receivers in the back half of the first round. So
I think that makes a lot of sense. That was going to be my follow-up question, because I do think like there are Troy Franklin people who might take him ahead of a first-round wide receiver. There are a couple of them, in fact, Pearsall and Legette. There are A.D. Mitchell people. There are Ladd McConkey people. Are you pretty much of the mind that the first-round wide receivers should all go before any of the round 2 or 3 guys this year?
Yes. That's
really. There can be exceptions to that, but there needs to be a really good reason for it. And for this class, at least, you don't have any of those guys where you have a really good reason for it. I think we should move now to everyone's favorite part of Dynasty. Well, everybody says it's their favorite part of fantasy football until you send them a trade offer, and then they ignore it or they're a jerk about it. Yeah. But getting trades done, I want to attack this from 2 different angles. And the first is, like, how do you get more trades done? And then the second we'll talk about later is like how you're actually approaching the trades and what trying to quote unquote win them, or at least make your team better. But do you have any strategies just for like people struggling to get trades done in fantasy leagues, and what you think are the best ways to get that done?
Send more offers.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I see that people all the time will say, well, I can't get a trade done. I put a trade bait up and no one sent me an offer. Well, You got to, I mean, what's marketing, right? I mean,
Right.
marketing isn't just putting up a billboard and hoping that someone will show up. Marketing is calling, it's mailing, it's emailing, it's texting, it's all this. Just how do people sell you things, right? They try to contact you, right? I mean, it's the same way in Dynasty, right? It's not that different. So again, just send more offers. And if you're not comfortable, one of the things that early on in Dynasty, I had a really hard time with sending offers, because I was playing in a couple of leagues, and I was really, I had all this attachment to these players, and I didn't want to make a mistake and all these things. That's something I see all the time. What I would recommend to people is adopt an orphan, especially a bad one, right? Just take an experiment, right? Take a team that's awful, right? That someone's offering you a free year of an entry fee just to manage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just trade it. Right. I don't care. Right. I don't care about what happens. My team's horrible. It's going to be bad anyways. Let's just use it as an experiment. Let's try and trade. Let's try and do stuff. Let's send 10 offers. Let's send 20 offers. Let's just keep sending offers. And what that does, it's like taking a batting weight off a bat, right? You start swinging it. You're saying, okay, I feel comfortable with this. Then you take off the weight, and all of a sudden you go out and you're actually in a normal league, and you're like, wow, I feel a lot more comfortable moving these picks or moving these players or sending anything like that. So that's I think the key thing on trading is just do it more, right? I mean, that just do it, right? And if you're nervous about doing it, get some more leagues that don't mean anything to you, right? If you're nervous about trading a home league, get in a league where it's a bunch of strangers, where the buy-in's low. It doesn't matter if you lose, and just try it, right? Just experiment, right? It's like anything. The other thing I think that I see people trade aimlessly. They're just trading to trade, right? They're just trading. And I think that is a mistake, because I do find myself to be one of the more active traders, but all of it's got an intent.
Right.
All of it has a reason, right? What am I doing? And I think, like, I start off and I talk about, in my Dynasty team building guide that I got over at AOD, in my podcast that I release, I release podcasts every day for AOD subscribers. Like, when I do those things, one of the things I talk about is, like, your strategy, your actions, your moves, your transactions should all reflect your strategy, right? So if you're coming into a trade and you're just like start pressing buttons, like, what are you trying to accomplish, right? What is it that you are trying to accomplish by sending this trade? Is it just to make a trade, or are you trying to actually do something with your team? And I think if you answer that question honestly, I think a lot of people will just kind of go in and just start hitting buttons and trading. Whereas I think a lot of people kind of can put their team in the wrong direction by not having a plan. Right? Have a plan, go in and execute it. And that allows you to get good prices. Like earlier, like kind of wrap it together. Like what we were talking about earlier with like Mike Evans, and like you're asking me undervalued wide receivers. Like I've got like 4 or 5 of them. Right. And so if I go in and I'm like, all right, I have a hole at my receiver position. Okay, well, let's go check on the price of Mike Evans. So that seems like a lot. Well, if I'm just locked in on Mike Evans, I'm either going to pay it or I'm not. And maybe I'm paying too high of a price for Mike Evans in a trade. But if I say I'm not really trying to get Mike Evans, right? I'm trying to get a productive wide receiver who's discounted. Okay, well, who reflects that? Well, Mike Evans is one of them. Devontae Adams is another. I mean, maybe Deebo Samuel, right? You kind of can create a list of guys where you can go in and send similar offers to different people and get a deal done that way. And I think that helps you trade more effectively. So your strategy should reflect your actions. And I think that's particularly true in trading.
I love that. And we're going to get into contending in just a second, but just to add on to that, I think it works the same way when you're trying to get rid of someone. And and some people don't like this. I like to publicize it. Like I had in our staff IDP Dynasty League 2 years ago, I think I had 4 or 5 of the top 12 linebackers that year. And so we're going into the next year, and it's like year 3 or 4 of this league. And honestly, a couple of the guys had just gone in with the idea that IDP doesn't matter. And so I'm going to just focus on my offense and I'll just start whoever on defense. And they were learning that didn't work. So I'm trying to trade one of these top 12 linebackers for a late round 2 rookie pick. No dice. Nobody's going to do it. We don't value them like that. So I just sent out a message to the league. I said, I'm going to send a trade offer to every one of you. I think it was Darius Leonard at the time or somebody for your 3rd round rookie pick. And the first one of you accepts gets him. And I literally went through and offered Darius Leonard to 13 different teams at the 14-team league. And soon enough, he was gone and on somebody else's roster. Now, maybe if I'd gone slower and offered him the team with 301 first, then 302, then 303, but I also may not have gotten a response from half of those teams by the time they were on the clock. I just kind of like to put it out there and say, I'm selling this guy for this price. Who wants him? If somebody accept the offer. Joe had a question that kind of transitions us into the next thing. And I think it can still work on that trading talk as well, because that have a plan idea. There's different thoughts on this as well. I've generally preached on this show that I like to be all in on contending, all in on rebuilding, or occasionally, like if I'm not one of those two things, it's because I'm making that transition from the rebuild into contending. I might have 1 year in the middle, but I don't want to have a year in the middle going the other way. And so Joe asks, and I get this question a lot when we do mailbags, is there a good way to know if you're a contender during the off season? I narrowly lost the championship last year, but I am worried about regression. And I will say that, like, first off, Joe, I think you're ahead of people just by considering the fact that this team that was in contention last year might not be next year. I have done a complete teardown a year after losing a championship because sometimes that makes sense. So is there anything you're looking for when you're in that contending mode, either going towards being a contender or maybe towards the end of that, that really you're using to decide that you are a contender that year?
It's a really good question. I think there's two things that I would point you towards. Okay. Two real easy ways to figure out if you're a contender. Number one, count how many top 30 assets you have in your league, on your team. Okay. So if it's super flex, right, count, and you don't need to be complicated about this. Just go and see how many guys are in the top 30 of ADP. Okay.
Right.
And if you've got 3 of them, you're a contender, right? If you've got 4 of them, you should get a buy, right?
Okay.
Because that's a real simple way to look at these things. It can get more complicated than that again, but that's, if you just do that, and if you have 3 guys that are in the top 30 of ADP, you should be in the playoffs, right? That's just the way the numbers kind of work. With the caveat that guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. or Caleb Williams, right? Like, they don't really count for that because you're not really expecting like year 1 production.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. When you say top 30 of ADP,
right,
when you're talking about a contender for this year, are you talking Dynasty ADP or redraft ADP?
I'm talking about, I'm generally talking about Dynasty ADP.
Okay.
But so I would say, like, it's kind of a 2-part thing, right? Do I have top 30 assets? And then if I've got 3 of those top 30 guys, okay, are they contending guys? Right. Is it Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels and Marvin Harrison, or is it, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? Like, what do we like? Obviously, you have to use some kind of judgment or wisdom there on that. But generally, if you have 3 guys that are productive guys that are in the top 30 of ADP, you should be thinking you can contend this year. Okay. And the way, like, I could get super nerdy and super geeky and all those things, but the way that works is the difference between, like, the difference that those guys make is substantially more than the difference between the guys between like a 50 pick gap between 50 and 100, right? The gap on those is really small. Right? The gap up at the top, those guys can run up a huge advantage for you. So that way some of that smaller stuff doesn't quite matter as much. That's the basic premise of that. Okay, so that'd be the first place I'd look. The second thing that I would do, if you have a question about this regression, sit down, look at your team. And I actually have a sheet of paper I do this on. I actually have a thing. And if that person has more questions, DM me and I'll send it to you. But you have 3 ways that your team can get better. Okay. 3 ways your team can get worse. And that actually forces you to be a little bit introspective about your team, because you'll say, like, okay, well, listen, I had Dallas Goedert last year and he missed a ton of the season, right? I had Mark Andrews and he missed a bunch of the season. Okay. So those are things that, like, I could get better from those, right? But 3 things that could be worse, like, okay, maybe I was really dependent on Raheem Mostert, right? Maybe I was really dependent on, last year, Demarcus Robinson down the stretch of last season was like my wide receiver 3. Right. Maybe, right, that you have like these sorts of things where you're like really dependent on things that are unlikely to happen again. Right. So that gives you, if you are really kind of honest in that, that'll give you a good idea. Right. And the last thing that I would say is, look at what your team record was last year and compare it to, you can do one of two things. You can compare it to your all play record, right? Which is if you played everyone every week, right? What would happen? Okay. And compare the two, right? If they're close, that means you're probably about what you should have been, right? If you might have a team that, is a 500 team in terms of all play record, but you should have won 75% of your games. Right. In terms of the other way, right? You can flip flop, right? Take a look at that and think about that. And then if you don't have all play records, just look at points, right? Where did I finish in terms of record and points, right? Was I the second best record, but the 8th most points, or was I vice versa, right? Because your record can be highly fluctuating year to year, right? Look at those other more fundamental things, and that'll tell you the true status of where your team was last year. And you can think for Joe, like specifically, what was your record? Right. Because again, if you were 10-4 and you're like, I'm worried about regression, that's maybe 2 games. You're 8-6 at worst. Right. Like that's kind of right. If you're 7-7, right, and you're riding Raheem Mostert to a finals, we might have a problem. Right. But so those would be kind of things I think about.
So let's say that we've gone through this exercise. We've decided we are a contender. I will ask you next how that changes your dynasty movements and strategy and everything. But first, this time of year specifically, I mentioned I've got a rookie draft going on right now. A lot of people have slow rookie drafts going on or coming up shortly or just completed. When you're a contender, and maybe let's just say you have your own normal picks to those late round picks, how willing are you to buy like contender pieces? Mike Evans, for example, maybe Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, those types of guys this time of year versus waiting until October, November when the trade deadline gets here.
So when drafts are going on, rookie picks tend to be inflated, right? So let's talk, because this is a little bit different here. Current picks, right? So 2024 picks tend to be a little bit inflated if you're in a draft, right? So you might be able to trade, a second round pick that's going, later than Mike Evans, for example,
right?
In a rookie draft, right? So I'm very aggressive doing those things, right? Like current year picks. What I don't like to do is trade future year picks right now, because, and I'll give you an example, right? Last year, Puka Nacua, right? 2 weeks in, if you had looked at his numbers and were like, dear God, this could be a top 5 wide receiver, like there was absolutely that, like in his range of outcomes based on what his numbers were. And at this point last year, no one thought that, right? Not even Puka Nacua's mother didn't think he was going to be a top 5 wide receiver last year. That did not happen. Okay. You want to be able to have the flexibility to target those players.
Right.
Okay. And that's not to mean that every guy that starts good, you want to trade for, right? But the guys that are truly substantially different than we expected them coming into the season, their price doesn't catch up to them. Okay. So you want to be able to have some flexibility to potentially target those guys. Kyron Williams is a really good example last year as well. Like no one really thought he was going to come into the season, be a starter. And all of a sudden in week 2, he was playing like 95% of snaps, but no one saw really that coming. You want to have the flexibility to do that. Right. The other thing is like, you can have the flexibility trading for, if you have pick flexibility and all this flexibility in the future, trading for contending players is really easy.
Yeah.
Because what happens is like 3 or 4 teams fall out of it early, and then they become terrified that their old player is going to retire, right? That Mike Evans is going to never play again, right? He's never going to be at a competitive team. And what they end up doing is they end up being sellers, just almost fire sale, more so than you would think. And you get discounts on players that you couldn't get now. Right. And those, trading in season, if you're a contender, it actually is a much better market for buyers than it is sellers, because the sellers are panicked, and the buyers, if you exercise a little bit of patience and can kind of shop around a little bit, you get really good deals on that. So to answer your question in a succinct way, after I give you all that, current picks, trade them for contending players. Future picks, hold on to them. You can still trade them for contending players, but let those situations reveal themselves a little bit more.
Anything else you would say that's really significantly different in your approach to Dynasty when you're in that contending window?
Just win. I don't close contending windows. I know you said like you're either rebuilding or you're retooling. I'm always, people right now will declare themselves it's June, right? You don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in August, let alone November or December. We think we might know, but like no one would have pegged Puka Nacua or I mean, let's say you were last year right now and you were like, well, I drafted CJ Stroud and I've got, I took a flyer on Puka Nacua and I took Sam Laporta in the mid-second. And, I'm not a contending team, so let's trade away my good players, right? If you did that, you just seeded away like a 1 seed, right? You just fell into like an enormous dynasty season because you were like, I'm scared of holding on to, Mike Evans and I need to trade it for a future second, right? Like you got to be careful on doing those things. So I never close contending windows, even when it might seem bleak. I'm always trying to win. And, again, the other thing I would say about that is like, if you have top 30 guys, right? If you have 3 of them, right, you should be on track for a playoff team. And if you've only got 2 of them, right, the easiest way to rebuild is to take 2 and turn it into 3, right? So it's not, people tend to rebuild from the bottom and think, oh, I got to build, I got to have, 17 top 150 assets. If you have 4 top 30 assets, you're like, that should be where you spend your time, is trying to get them. So when they're depressed, when they're injured, whatever, constantly being in on those guys, right, that's the payoff more so than lower on your team.
Excellent stuff. Let's take one more break and we'll finish up with, one of my favorite topics, the rebuilding dynasty team.
It's a Sunday in Seattle with another round of the Cascadia rivalry on CBS and streaming live on Paramount Plus. Keep your eyes on me.
So you kind of answered one of my questions there, is that process of going from contender to rebuilder. And there are different approaches to this. I always tell people the way that I do it works for me because I enjoy going through that process of kind of just like, how much can I get for all of these guys? And now I get all these assets and I'm going to rebuild it back up. Some people can't stand the idea of a full season of fantasy football where they're not trying to win that year. And I get that as well. But even if you don't like to do that, there comes certain points with a dynasty team to where you've tried to keep that window open, and all of a sudden it slams on your fingers. And it's like clear to the entire league, it's over. What's your approach to going through that rebuild?
If it's clear it's over, and like it should only really be clear at this point in the season to maybe like 1 team in your league.
Let's take the time. Let's talk about we're in October and it's clear.
Oh, okay. That's even better. Right. So I wouldn't rule it out now. So that's my big, that would be
right.
I'm 0-6. It's just before Halloween, right? We're sort of doing that. Again, be realistic on where your team is, right? Do the same exercise we talked about earlier, right? I had a team last year that was 1-6 with a 60% all play record last year. Right. I drew horribly, just a horrible luck. And I had to have a real assessment. Is that a teardown team? Not really. Like, it's a good team. It's just unlucky, right? It's not like, what am I going to tear it down and try and get better? Like, it's going to be, am I going to trade Josh Allen or Dak Prescott? Like,
right.
For what, to what end? Like, I'm just unlucky, right? So again, if I can kind of go into next year, maybe I can retool a little bit. I don't want to necessarily tear that team down, right? So have a real kind of assessment there of that. I think, more so than selling, I think rebuilding is about trying to take asymmetric bets, okay? Trying to take bets that have very low risk and a very high payoff. So you kind of think about guys that are injured, right? You think about guys like, even like last year, like Kyron Williams, right? Didn't make a ton of sense as like a rebuilding guy, but if you could get him for a 3rd round pick, all of a sudden, when he was injured, which he was a throw-in in some trades at that point, and all of a sudden he becomes like a top 25 dynasty asset at a period of time. You're all of a sudden in a massively different position, right? So I think those types of deals, again, like that Puka Nacua example, again, when those guys truly are different, right? They don't happen that often, but when they're truly different, be aggressive on them. Those things can really turn around your team. Right? Buying low and being aggressive when injuries happen. If you had problems at quarterback, you should have been all in on Kyler Murray. Right? You should have been figuring out ways to attack Kyler Murray. I think that's something to definitely target, right? And a lot of times, like, some of the injury stuff or some of the suspension risk stuff, like Rashee Rice right now. I mean, if Rashee Rice is suspended, like, I'd set the over under at 4.5 games and take the under on it. And if that happens, like, he's massively underpriced.
Right.
He's massively underpriced. And so be in on those things. And when you're a rebuilding team, you should have a huge tolerance for risk, right? You should have a huge tolerance for risk. And that's not to say just kind of willy-nilly, but you want to be in on guys that are depressed for some reasons, off of injuries, off of suspension risks, off of, whatever, right? Like truly buy low, and not just poor performance buy low, but buy it's a fire sale, right? Buy things that are literally coming out of the fire type deal, right? Those are the types of things that can really turn your team around. But again, focus on the top of your roster, right? Can I get another top 30 guy? Because if you can, right, that transforms your team much better than any, targeting 3 or 4 guys that are in the top 120 of ADP.
I think any talk about rebuilding has to at least include some sort of discussion on tanking. I guess not so much about your personal preference, whether you want to tank for a specific pick, but in leagues that you're the commissioner of or participate in, do you advise any sort of rules around tanking, or everybody's paying their entry fee, let them run their own team?
I think the latter part of that, where I think tanking's unfortunate is where it disproportionately helps people. Like, I play in a home league that someone started 3-2 and I played them while they were being serious, and then they stopped playing. Right. And then they ceded, I lost to them when they were like decent, and then they ceded a win to everyone else in the league, which that's aggravating.
Right.
That's really aggravating. So that would be like the thing. There's some ways to go about it. Again, the entry price, right? Make it, if you have a constant problem with tanking and people throwing away their entry fees, make them more expensive, right? That's one way to curb it. The other way to curb it would be to some sort of lottery. I've seen people do that. I think the concern most with tanking is people, again, disproportionately setting lineups and that sort of thing. So one of the ways that we do it in one of the leagues, a lot of league formats that I play, is just by potential points.
Right.
It's an imperfect measure, but that's something that you can't tank your way. You can't. Well,
that drives
more tank your lineup.
Right. That drives more trading, because then that, like, 100%. you don't get to keep all these guys on your roster and be bad. You've got to trade them away if you want to truly tank, and less teams are going to want to tank if that's the way you're going about it.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. And again, people will, and there's more strategy in that too, right? Like, it's funny because I play in a format that's got potential points as the draft order, independent of whether you make the playoffs, unless you finish in the money, right? So if you're a top 3 team, you draft the order of which you finish. Right, the winner picks 12th, and the runner up 10th, and the guy in 3rd place picks 10th. And then everyone else is by potential points, right? So there isn't a reason to tank the bottom, like tank the last 2 games to say I want to be out of the playoffs to get a high pick, right? It incentivizes everyone to be in, right? So I think those things, right, we're incentivizing people to kind of do the right thing in terms of lineup setting. And if people, there's a guy that I'm convinced the only possible rationale for his decisions is that he's consistently tanking in my home league, right? Yeah. That's the only thing that would make sense, but he does it by selling his future first, right? Consistently every year makes decisions. He's just adding money to the pot, right? I mean, I can't stop that. Like that's a gift, right? It's a gift. So, I mean, you got to kind of be, accepting of that too.
Awesome stuff, Jordan. Tell everybody one more time where they can find your work and what you've got coming up.
Yeah, go ahead and follow me on X at McNamara Dynasty. Check out over at Football Guys. I got a series of articles that are starting off. And again, over at analyticsdynasty.com, I've got the Dynasty team building guide, which will give you kind of a lot of the stuff we've talked about. It's evergreen content, right? It's just talking about strategy and different ideas. It's over 100 pages. You can go in and dive into all of that. And again, I release podcasts every day for my subscribers over at analytics@dynasty.com. I'm going to do a promo code DAD for Father's Day, DAD, 20% off. So you can go ahead and check that out and get anything 20% off, for the next week.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, producer Harry, for helping us out this week. It's been fantastic. Thank you to everybody who was in the chat, and we will talk to you all next Tuesday.